Welcome to the MasterMind Library. They call me Ferdinand, the bringer of balance, leader of many disciplines, and one of your hosts of the MasterMind Library, the home of the MasterMind Book Club on FHTII.com. What's going on, Trigger? How you doing today? You doing good?
Yep.
Okay, all right, well, hey. So, why don't you tell us about who's in our live audience today?
Dada, Didi, Huey, DC, Twitter, Daddy. No, Huey.
Yeah, Huey.
Yeah,
Sincere
Divya,
and Elijah.
Dada.
Very good. All right. So today we're on episode 156 on the MasterMind Library. High five. Good job. Very good. And we are on the last chapter of Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Are you ready to finish out this book?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. All right, very good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started.
Ba 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 ba.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started, buddy. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's get it up on the screen for everybody. So we're in our last chapter of Secrets of the Federal Reserve, and we are going to go ahead and make it a little bigger for everyone. Well, we got to first go to the page we need to be on. So let's do that.
Daddy, the ABD.
You remember your ABCs?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're gonna I'm finding the page, everybody. Bear with me just for a second.
Right here.
Daddy's gotta find the page that starts the page. All right, there we go, right there. Chapter 14, Congressional Expose. That should be good enough as far as the size for everybody. That's pretty big, Trey. What do you think about that right there? Hey, what do you think about that? Is it good?
Me, Huey?
Okay, so I think it's good. Okay, all right, cool. Thank you very much for helping. All right, so we're on, like I was saying, everybody, we're in episode 156, chapter 14. So let's go ahead and get started. Congressional Expose. Mr. Volcker's politics is something of an enigma, New York Times. Since 1933, when Eugene Meyer resigned from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, no member of the international banking families has personally served on the Board of Governors. They have chosen to work from behind the scenes through carefully selected presidents of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and other employees. The present chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is Paul Volcker. His appointment was greeted by one well-known economist with the following prediction: Volcker's selection has been by far the worst. Carter has put Dracula in charge of the blood bank. To us, it means a crash and depression in the 80s is more certain than ever. Colonel E.C. Harwood's research report, August 6, 1979, gave much the same view. Paul Volcker is from the same mold as the unsound money men who have misguided the monetary actions of this nation for the past 5 decades. The outcome probably will be equally disastrous for the dollar and the U.S. economy. Despite these gloomy views, the report from the New York Times on the selection of Volcker was positively ecstatic. On July 26, 1979, the Times commented that Volcker learned the business from Robert Russa, now partner of Brown Brothers Harriman, and that Volcker had been part of the Russa Brain Trust at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and later at the Treasury in the Kennedy administration. David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase, and Mr. Russa were strong influences in the Mr. Carter decision to name Mr. Volcker for the Reserve Board chairmanship. The New York Times did not point out that David Rockefeller and Robert Russa had previously chosen Mr. Carter, a member of the Trilateral Commission, as the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, or that Mr. Carter would hardly refuse to appoint their choice of Paul Volcker as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Nor is it straining the point to be reminded that this manner of selection of the chairman of the Board of Governors is directly in line in the line of royal prerogative, going back to George Peabody's initial agreement with N.M. Rothschild to the Jekyll Island meeting and to the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act. The Times noted that Volcker's choice was approved by European banks in Bonn, Frankfurt, and Zurich. William Simon, former Secretary of Treasury, was quoted as saying, "A marvelous choice." The Times further noted that the Dow market rose on Volcker's nomination, registering the best gains in 3 weeks for a rise of 9.73 points, and that the dollar rose sharply on foreign exchange at home and abroad. Who was Volcker that his appointment could have such an effect on the stock market and the value of the dollar in foreign exchange? He represented the most powerful house of the London connection, Brown Brothers Harriman, and the London houses, which directed the Rockefeller Empire. On July 29, 1979, the Times has said of Volcker, "New man will chart his own course." Volcker's background shows that this was nonsense. His course has always been charted for him by his masters in London. He attended Princeton, obtained an MA at Harvard, and went to the London School of Economics, 1951 through 52, the Bankers Graduate School. He then came to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as an economist from 1952 through 57, economist at Chase Manhattan Bank, 1957 through 61, with Treasury Department, 1961 through 65, as Deputy Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, 1963 through 65, and Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, 1969 through 74. He then became president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from 1975 through 79, when Carter, at the behest of Robert Russa and David Rockefeller, appointed him chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. He was succeeded as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York by Anthony Solomon, a Harvard PhD, who was with OPA 1941 through 42, and with the government financial mission to Iran 1942 through 46. He operated a canned food company in Mexico from 1951 through 61, was president of International Investment Corporation for Yugoslavia 1969 through 72, a communist country, Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs at Treasury 1977 through 80. In short, Solomon's background was much the same as Paul Volcker's. The New York Times stated on December 2nd, 1981, "For years, the Federal Reserve was the second or third most secret institution in town. The Sunshine Act of 1976 penetrated the curtain a trifle. The board now holds a public meeting once a week on Wednesday at 10 a.m., but not to discuss monetary policy, which is still regarded as top secret and not to be discussed in public." The Times mentioned that when open market committee meetings are held, Solomon and Volcker sit together at the head of the table and relay the instructions which they have received from abroad. Behind Volcker and Solomon stands Robert Russa, Secretary of the Treasury in Carter's shadow cabinet, and representing Brown Brothers Harriman, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, and the Royal Economic Institute. He is a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation and a director of Texaco and American Express companies. Dr. Martin Larson points out that the international consortium of financiers known as the Bilderbergers, who meet annually in profound secrecy to determine the destiny of the Western world, is a creature of the Rockefeller-Rothschild alliance, and that it held its third meeting on St. Simon's Island, only a short distance from Jekyll Island. Larson also states that the Rockefeller interests work in close alliance with the Rothschilds and other central banks. On June 18, 1983, President Ronald Reagan ended months of speculation by announcing that he was reappointing Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors for another 4-year term. Although Volcker's term was not up until August 6, 1983, Reagan's reappointment of a Carter appointee puzzled some political observers, but apparently he had succumbed to considerable pressure. as indicated by a lead editorial in the Washington Post, June 10th, 1983. There is no one who matches Mr. Volcker in political standing and grasp of the intricate networks that make up the world's financial system. The anonymous writer gave no documentation for his elevation of Volcker to the standing of the world's greatest financier. And as for his political standing, the New York Times commented on June 19, 1983, Mr. Volcker's politics is something of an enigma. His non-political stance conforms with the Washington tradition of the political independence of the Fed, which has been maintained for many years. However, the problem of his independence on the London connection has never been discussed in Washington. In reality, Volcker is more of a politician than an economist. After attending the London School of Economics and finding out who issues the orders of the international financial community, Volcker has never since played the game. Not once has he failed to carry out the orders of the London connection. Can it really be possible that the London connection exists and that men like Volcker and Solomon receive their instructions in however devious or indirect a manner from foreign bankers? Let us look at the evidence, circumstantial to be sure, but circumstantial evidence of the quality which has often sent men to the penitentiary or to the electric chair. John Moody pointed out in 1911 that 7 men of the Morgan Group, allied with the Standard Oil Kuhn-Loeb Group, ruled the United States. Where do these groups stand in the financial picture today? U.S. News published on April 11, 1983, a list of the largest bank holding companies in the United States by assets as of December 31st, 1982. Number 1 is Citicorp, New York, with assets of $130 billion. This is Baker and Morgan's First National Bank of New York, merged with National City Bank in 1955, 2 of the largest purchasers of Federal Reserve Bank of New York stock in 1914. Number 3 is Chase Manhattan, New York, with assets of $80.9 billion. This is Chase and Bank of Manhattan merged. The Rockefeller and Kuhn-Loeb Group, also purchasers of Federal Reserve Bank of New York stock in 1914. Number 4 is Manufacturers Hanover of New York, $64 billion, also purchasers of Federal Reserve Bank of New York stock in 1914. Number 5 is JP Morgan Company of New York, $58.6 billion in assets and holder of considerable Federal Reserve Bank stock. Number 6 is Chemical Bank of New York, $48.3 billion, also purchaser of Federal Reserve stock in 1914. And number 11, First Chicago Corporation, the First National Bank of Chicago, which was principal correspondent of the Morgan Baker Bank in New York, and which furnished the first 2 presidents of the Federal Advisory Council. The direct line which leads from the participants in the Jekyll Island Conference of 1910 to the present day is illustrated by a passage from A Primer on Money, Committee on Banking and Currency, U.S. House of Representatives, 88th Congress, 2nd Session, August 1st, 1964, page 75. The practical effect of requiring all purchases to be made through the open market is to take money from the taxpayer and give it to the dealers. It forces the government to pay a toll for borrowing money. There are 6 bank dealers: First National City Bank of New York, Chemical Crop Exchange Bank, New York, Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, New York, Bankers Trust of New York, First National Bank of Chicago, and Continental Illinois Bank of Chicago. Thus, the banks which receive a toll on all money borrowed by the government of the United States are the same banks which planned the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. There is ample evidence demonstrating the present preeminence of the same banks which set up the Federal Reserve System in 1914. For instance, Warren Brooks writes on the editorial page of the Washington Post, June 6, 1983, Citicorp, National City Bank, and First National Bank of New York merged in 1955, just recorded an 18.6% return on equity. JP Morgan, 17%. Chemical Bank and Bankers Trust, nearly 16%, an exceptional rate of return. These are the banks which bought the first issue of Federal Reserve Bank stock in 1914, and which owned the controlling interest in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which sets the interest rate and is the bank for all open market operations. These banks also profit steadily from the otherwise inexplicable fluctuations in monetary growth and interest rates. Brooks further comments on actual monetary growth rates alternately gyrating from 0 to 17% in successive 6-month periods for 3 recession-racked years. The two measures of money growth most admired by Milton Friedman, M2 and M3, have actually shown little change on a year-to-year basis in the 1972 through 82 period. Thus, we have money growth rates gyrating from 0 to 17%, but no actual year-to-year changes, which raises the question of why we cannot have stability of monetary growth throughout the year. The answer is that the big profits are made by these gyrations. And the next question is, who sets in motion these gyrations? The answer is the London connection. To draw attention from the continued control of the bankers and their heirs, who obtained the government monopoly of the nation's money and credit in 1913, the paid propagandists of the controlled media monopoly and academia are constantly trotting forth new and more exotic theories of economics. Thus, James Burnham, one of the National Review propagandists, won fame with a ridiculous theory of the managers. He postulated that the old arbiters of wealth, the J.P. Morgans, the Warburgs, and the Rothschilds had, by 1950, disappeared from the scene, being replaced by a new class of managers. This theory, which had no foundation in fact, served to obscure the fact that the same people still control the monetary system of the world. The managers were just that, executives like Volcker, who were frontmen, paid employees who would continue to receive their paychecks only as long as they carried out their employer's instructions. Burnham remains a well-paid propagandist at the National Review, which many prominent leaders, including President Reagan, believed to be a conservative publication. From 1914 to 1982, a period in which many thousands of American banks went bankrupt, the original purchasers of Federal Reserve Bank stock have not only survived, but they have consolidated their power. And what of the London connection? Does it still exist? And is it still dictating the economic destiny of the United States? The Washington Post, May 19th, 1983, carried a story datelined Nairobi, Kenya, noting the meeting of the African Development Bank, the British Merchant Bank, Morgan Greenfell, and a syndicate of the United States, Kuhn Loeb, Lehman Brothers International, the French Lazard Frères, and Britain's Warburg are discreetly acting as financial advisors to about 10 debt-plagued African states. There are the same names we encountered in 1914, still managing the finances of the world, with profits for themselves, but with disastrous results for everyone else. Perhaps we can look for relief to the present administration of President Reagan. Unfortunately, before reaching him, we have to run the gamut of the long list of his principal staff, composed of men from J. Henry Schroeder, Brown Brothers Harriman, and other leading components of the London connection. Lopez Portillo, president of Mexico, in addressing the Mexican National Congress of Mexico in September 1982, called the world credit boom of the past decade a financial pestilence akin to the Black Death, which swept Europe in the 14th century. As in medieval times, it flattens country after country. It is transmitted by rats, and it yields unemployment and misery, industrial bankruptcy, and enrichment by speculation. The remedy prescribed by faith healers is forced inactivity and depriving the patient of food. Forbes magazine stated October 11, 1982, the world gasps for liquidity, not because the supply of money has contracted, but because too much of it now goes to pay off old debts rather than fund new productive investments. The policy of high interest rates and tight money has been disastrous for the United States. In early 1983, a slight easing of money and credit promises some relief. But as long as the Federal Reserve System and its unseen manipulators continued their control of the money supply, we can expect more problems. The Nation on December 11th, 1982, in commenting on economic problems, stated, "The blame for all this lies at the door of the Federal Reserve System, working as usual on behalf of the international banking system. The evidence of how the Federal Reserve System works on behalf of the international banking system is graphically illustrated by a series of charts drawn up by the staff of the Committee on Banking, Currency, and Housing of the House of Representatives, 94th Congress, Second Session, August 1976. Federal Reserve Directors, a study of corporate and banking influence. We present as our Chart 5, page 49 of this study, showing the interlocking directorates of David Rockefeller. As our chart 6, we reproduce page 55 of this study, showing the interlocking directorates of Frank R. Milliken, one of the Class C directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In this chart, all the main passages, all the main personages in our story of the Jekyll Island Conference: Citibank, J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn Loeb and Company, and many related firms. As Chart 7, we produce page 53 of this study, showing the interlocking directorates of another Class C director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Alan Pfeiffer. As president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, he interlocks with J. Henry Schroeder Company, J. Henry Schroeder Trust Company, J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, Rockefeller Center Incorporated, Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Equitable Life Assurance Society, J.P. Morgan, and others. Thus, an August 1976 study from the House Committee on Banking, Currency, and Housing brings before us all of our main cast of personages, functioning today just as they did in 1914. Due to space limitations, only 5 of the 75 charts in the study, all of which show the connections between prominent, powerful individuals with control in the Federal Reserve System, have been selected to illustrate the connections between officers and directors of the 12 Federal Reserve banks in 1976 and the firms listed in this book. The 3 Class C directors are appointed by the Board of Governors as representatives of the public interest as a whole, page 34, Congressional Study, 1976. The 120-page congressional study details public policy functions of the Federal Reserve District banks, how directors are selected, who is selected, the public relations lobbying factor, bank domination and bank examination, and corporate interlocks with reserve banks. Charts were used to illustrate Class A, Class B, and Class C directorships of each district bank. For each branch bank, a chart was designed giving information regarding bank-appointed directors and those appointed by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. In his foreword to the study, Chairman Henry S. Roos, District, Wisconsin, wrote, Wisconsin delegate. This committee has observed for many years the influence of private interests over the essentially public responsibilities of the Federal Reserve System. As the study makes clear, it is difficult to imagine a more narrowly based board of directors for a public agency than has been gathered together for the 12 banks of the Federal Reserve System. Only 2 segments of American society, banking and big business, have any substantial representation on the boards, and often even these become merged through interlocking directorates. Small farmers are absent. Small business is barely visible. No women appear on the board, on the district boards, and only 6 among the branches. System-wide, including district and branch boards, only 13 members from minority groups appear. The study raises a substantial question about the Federal Reserve's oft-repeated claim of independence. One might ask, Independent from what? Surely not banking or big business. If we are to judge from the massive interlocks revealed by this analysis of the district boards, the big business and banking dominance of the Federal Reserve System cited in this report can be traced, in part, to the original Federal Reserve Act, which gave member commercial banks the right to select 2/3 of the directors of each district bank. But the Board of Governors in Washington must share the responsibility for this imbalance. They appoint the so-called public members of the board of each district bank, appointments which have largely reflected the same narrow interests of the bank elected members. Until we have basic reforms, the Federal Reserve System will be handicapped in carrying out its public responsibilities as an economic stabilization and bank regulatory agency. The system's mandate is too essential to the nation's welfare to leave so much of the machinery under the control of narrow private interests. Concentration of economic and financial power in the United States has gone too far. In a section of the text entitled "The Club System," the committee noted, "This club approach leads the Federal Reserve to consistently dip in the same pools, the same companies, the same universities, the same bank holding companies to fill directorships. This congressional study concludes as follows. Many of the companies on these tables, as mentioned earlier, have multiple interlocks to the Federal Reserve System: First Bank Systems, Southeast Banking Corporation, Federated Department Stores, Westinghouse Electric Corporation, Procter & Gamble, Alcoa, Honeywell Incorporated, Kennecott Copper, Owens Corning Fiberglass. All have 2 or more director ties to district or branch banks. In summary, the Federal Reserve directors are apparently representatives of a small elite group which dominates much of the economic life of this nation." End of congressional report. And that right there concludes the book. We have made it to the end, y'all. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in and checked out Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Powerful material in here. We've learned a lot about the different families that are in pretty much full control of every civilized nation on the planet because they're in control of their money, right? So read this book, y'all. Pull it out, crack it open, go one chapter at a time. Do some Google searches on these families. Do some Google searches on these businesses. Take a look at the Federal Reserve Act. Take a look at some of these other acts that was put in place. There's a lot that has happened in the last 100 years, and we need to be privy to it because as the wave moves forward, there's about to be a change of leadership around the world. And in that change of leadership, we got to have people who are effectively and efficiently prepared. That may be you. That may be me. That may be my son. That may be my daughters. It may be one of my sons. It may be one of my daughters. It may be one of your children. So we must prepare to retake our mantles of leadership. That $500 million of gold, and it was worth $500 million then. What it's worth now, I'm telling you, it's all through the roof what it's worth now. That will be returned. That gold is not gone forever. That gold will be returned. It will be put back into the hands of the people who have claim to it. Who have claim to it. Understand that this is all about to take place. So y'all be blessed and y'all expose your gift.